Good afternoon, everyone. If you could take your seats. I'm Elliot Gerson, and it is my great privilege to introduce the next session. It is really, in a sense, central to the theme of many of the things that you've been hearing about this week: the world on fire, populism, the rise of authoritarianism, and basically the whole mess in the world that we've been talking about through one prism or another over the last few days, and we will continue to. And we are going to have someone address the root causes of that in a way that no one else could. And he is someone who certainly needs no introduction. And I don't want to take time away from him. And after his remarks, you'll all have an opportunity to ask questions. But I will, given the fact that it is the 20th anniversary of the Ideas Festival, say something about our guest, who you know all about his distinctions. You read him, you follow him, you watch him. He also has a long history with the Institute. He co-founded and chairs Weave, the Social Fabric Project. But more significantly, although it's pretty wonderful, in the annals of the Ideas Festival, I can now say to you officially, because I went back to our archives and confirmed this, that no one has spoken at the Ideas Festival more than David Brooks, and appropriately. David, I think one reason when we created this, we had no idea if it would survive more than 2005. One reason it was so successful was David Brooks. And then a couple of years after that, he came, and he has been here every year since. There is no one spoken as often. A couple of other things that make him an exception here, and an entirely deserved exception. One is that early in this process of the Ideas Festival, Kenny and I decided that we would have a rule to make sure we keep things fresh and people would come back for new things every year. We had a rule that no one would speak more than 3 consecutive years. But of course, we had to have the David Brooks exception, and we do. And the other thing that this is an example of an exception of is that we decided at the very beginning that the format we would use in almost all instances is conversation and dialogue, either an interview or a moderated panel, and that we were not going to have lectures, as one often has at other kinds of conferences and events. But then again, given the wisdom, insight, and popularity of this man, we had to make a second David Brooks exception, which was to allow him to have these kinds of formats with regularity. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure and privilege to bring up David Brooks.
I should correct Elliot. I haven't actually spoken more than anybody else. It just seems that way. I read my first book for Book on Tape, and the sound engineer told me a story. When you read your book for audio, you realize how boring your book is and how often you repeat yourself. But the sound engineer told me the story that there was a novelist who was reading a 700-page novel, and he's in the middle of it, and the sound engineer looks in, and the novelist is weeping. And so the engineer says, "Is there something I can do?" And the novelist says, "Don't I ever shut up?" And so that's me at Aspen. Now, every other talk I've given here has been about how to live a better life, how to improve your life. This one is not. Because of the global situation, I thought I should rise to the occasion and try to diagnose the whole global situation. But I feel guilty about that if I don't give you some practical life tips, your lives will fall apart over the next year before I can give my next talk. So in the first few minutes, I'm going to give you some actual life hacks, which I've got from the internet or the Bible, one of the two. And so here are a few life hacks. These are practical life hacks, then I'll get to politics. When you have 90% of a large project finishing up the final details will take another 90%. Denying or deflecting a compliment is rude. Accept it with thanks. Getting cheated occasionally is a small price to pay for trusting the best in everyone. Because when you trust the best in others, they will treat you the best. Purchase a tourist guidebook to your hometown. You'll learn a lot playing tourist once a year. The thing that made you weird as a kid will make you outstanding as an adult. It's not an apology if it comes with an excuse. Just because it's not your fault doesn't mean it's not your responsibility. If you think you saw a mouse, you did, and if you saw one, there are others. If you can't make up your mind between two options, flip a coin, but don't go by how the coin comes up, go by your emotional reaction to how the coin went up. Take photos of your parents every day, that's how you'll want to remember them. If you meet a jerk once a month, you've met a jerk. If you meet a jerk every day, you're the jerk. Don't ever look at a recent photo of your first great love. And this one is from Warren Buffett. You can always tell someone to go to hell tomorrow, which is good. When you're mad at them, you can tell them to go to hell tomorrow. Wait a day. So that's my life-altering advice for you, crammed into about 90 seconds. Now we turn to politics. Now, I got my political start when I was 5. My parents were somewhat left-wing. We lived in New York, and they took me to a place where hippies would go called a be-in. And a be-in was where hippies would go to show how little they cared about money and material things. And one of the ways they showed this was they set a garbage can on fire, threw their wallets into it, just to show we don't care about money. I'm 5 years old. I see a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can. I break from the crowd, reach into the fire, grab the money, and run away. And that was sort of my first step over to the right. And so I veered right, and then I veered left. But the main thing I am, like all of us probably in this room, is I believe in liberal democracy. And I was a foreign correspondent in the 1990s at the high water mark of liberal democracy. I was in the Soviet Union. If you remember, in the final days of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin was the democratically elected president of Russia, and this old Soviet apparatus staged a coup. And they had tanks rolling through the town, and Yeltsin, if you recall, stood on a tank in front of the Russian White House, the parliament building, and said, "I dare you, shoot me." And all the democratic activists surrounded him to offer sort of a buffer. And I was there, and I found a woman who was handing out sandwiches to the democratic protesters. And her name was Valentina Kosieva, and she was 93. And so I asked her to tell me her life story. And she told me that she'd grown up in the palace of the Tsar before the revolution. Just after the revolution, she'd been lined up for a firing squad because she was on the wrong side of the Russian Revolution. Her mother saved her life. She got married. Her husband was disappeared in the 1930s, purged and sent to Siberia, never to return. Her 2 boys were killed in the Battle of Stalingrad by the Nazis. One of her sons was rifle-butted to death. And then she married again. Her second husband also was sent away to the Gulag, and she never saw him again. And then in the 1950s, under Khrushchev, she was part of the Kalmyk people, which is a Muslim people, and they were sent off to exile. And so my brilliant interviewing techniques when she's telling me this story is, and then what happened? And then what happened? And basically every bad thing that happened in Soviet history happened to her. And it was so moving to be talking to her at age 93, passing out sandwiches at what we thought would be the rise of democratic Russia. And it didn't turn out that way, obviously. And I covered in those days the end of apartheid. I covered the Oslo peace process. A participant is in the room. And I covered the reunification of Germany. I covered nothing but good news for 5 years. History has since taken a dark turn. And the interesting thing about the dark turn it has taken, especially this year, is that it's happening all around the world. I was raised with the idea that we Americans are outliers. We're more individualistic, we're more mobile, we're just outliers compared to most other countries in the world. That is not true anymore. The Ipsos organization, which is a British firm, asked people in 28 countries about certain attitudes. And we are absolutely typical of the world now. Our pessimism is typical. 59% of Americans say they believe our country is in decline. That's compared to 58% of people around the world. 60% of Americans agree with the statement the system is broken, compared to 61% worldwide. Our hostility to elites is absolutely typical. 69% of Americans think that the political and economic elite don't care about hardworking people, compared to 67% worldwide. 63% of Americans agree that experts in this country don't know what they're talking about, compared to 62% worldwide. We're just typical. Even our authoritarianism is typical. 66% of Americans say the country needs a strong leader to take it back from the rich and the powerful, compared to 63% worldwide. 40% of Americans, we need a strong leader who will break the rules, compared to 41% worldwide. So there are two things to take from this. The first is that we're typical. We're no longer extraordinary. We're a typical country with typical beliefs. And the second is that all around the world, in all these 28 countries measured, there's an incredible hostility to the system and an infertile landscape for right-wing populism. And if you look around elections of the world, it's a big election year, you see right-wing populists thriving in place after place. So Geert Wilders, a right-wing populist in the Netherlands, his party rose to power. In the European elections, the German AfD, a very far-right group, surged. In France, the Marine Le Pen party surged, causing the whole French political system to go into meltdown. You look at Indonesia, you look around Latin America, right-wing populists are surging all around the country. And of course, here at home, Donald Trump, I noticed The Economist says it's about 2/3 likely that Donald Trump will be a re-elected president. So that's typical of what's happening all around the world. And so to me, it's a mistake. We're gonna watch the debate tonight, but it's a mistake to see the US election in isolation from these global trends. And if Trump ends up winning, it'll be because there's just this global tide in country after country after country. And so, like, what's going on? Like, why has this happened? Why is it happening all around the world all at once? Now, there are certain obvious things we could say. People are reacting against globalization. There have been policy failures, the financial crisis, Afghanistan, Iraq. But these policy failures are not all around the world, and yet right-wing populism is all around the world. Something deeper is going on. And I think it's some sort of global, spiritual, relational, and moral crisis. And it shows up in the deepest essences of our societies. So first thing is, and I'll just take US statistics, we've just gotten a lot sadder as a society. Rising suicide rates, rising mental health problems. The number of people who say they have no close personal friends is up by 4-fold since 2000. The number of teenagers who say they are persistently hopeless and despondent is 45%. The number of people not in a romantic relationship is up by 1/3 since 2000. The number of people who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% since 2000. So we've just become a lot sadder as a society. And when you get sadder, you get meaner. I give you all these sad statistics. I could give you a bunch of mean statistics, gun violence, hate crimes. The one that gets to me, it used to be 2/3 of Americans give to charity. Now fewer than half of Americans give to charity. We've just become sadder and meaner. And that's deep in the fabric of society. We've also gotten a lot more pessimistic. And some of that is the media's fault. We've determined that we can get your eyeballs if we create headlines that generate fear and anger. And so the number of headlines that generate fear and anger is up by about 200% over the last 15 years. But it's not only the media. Some researchers took a look at sort of global conversation in print, starting in 1850 up till today. And they measured how many books, magazine articles, newspaper articles, whatever, how many of them were positive and how many were negative. And from 1850 to about 2008, most of this stuff was positive. There were dips during the Great Depression, which you'd expect, and there were increases in the 1990s when we had prosperity. But basically, we're a pretty happy country. And then starting in the financial crisis, but ever since, the negativity of American culture has just collapsed. So we have a more negative public culture than we did in the Great Depression, than during World War II, than during World War I, than any of the crises of the past 150 years. We just are an incredibly pessimistic country. And if you've even asked high school students, the share of high school students who say it's hard to have hope for my life has been surging. And so this negativity has a political valence. On the right, it manifests as catastrophism. And so I interview a lot of Trump people, and the general theme you hear over and over and over again is this country is on the verge of total destruction. Just a catastrophizing mentality. On the left, it shows up in the form of mental health problems and depression. And so 34% of conservatives say they report feeling in poor mental health at least half the time, 34% of conservatives. But 57% of progressive young people say they report feeling negative mental health. Just higher rates of mental health problems, higher rates of neuroticism, and it's very gendered. 41% of liberal males say they have poor mental health compared to 60% of liberal females. It's not clear to me why this is happening, but you see the mental health crisis feeding into our politics. And so my underlying point is that the global crisis of populism and the rise of authoritarianism is not just about policy and politics. We're undergoing a global spiritual recession. And a lot of people are trying to use politics as a form of social therapy. Remember, Ryan Streeter is a researcher formerly at the American Enterprise Institute. He discovered that people who call themselves lonely are 7 times more likely than others to be active in politics. So there's a lot of lonely people dominating our political activism. In a healthy society, we have what you call the politics of redistribution. We have big arguments, but they're arguments about how high taxes should be or where spending should go. And that's in a healthy society. We don't have that kind of politics anymore. We have the politics of recognition. People are going into politics in order to feel good about themselves and in order to make the other side feel shamed. They're going out for a sense of purpose and meaning. And so people are using politics to fill a hole in their own soul, to be affirmed and to get retribution on the people they dislike. Politics is a seductive form of social therapy because it seems to solve your spiritual and psychological problems. It gives you the illusion that there's a war of good and evil, and you're on the side of good. It gives you a moral landscape, so you get to have some meaning in your life. It gives people a sense of belonging. If you're lonely, suddenly you're part of Team Red or Team Blue. It gives people a sense of righteousness, that you don't have to sit with the widow or feed the poor, but if you get indignant in front of the TV set, you feel you're doing something right for the cause. And it gives people a sense of purpose, a sense that somehow they're contributing to something larger than themselves. The problem is, if you're asking politics to fill a hole in your soul, to solve your psychological, relational, and moral problems, you're asking more of politics than it can give you. Because you don't really have community. You're not working with others. You're just hating the same people. You don't really have moral action. You're just indignant in front of the TV set. There's not really a morally comprehensible landscape. It's not like one side has the monopoly on virtue and the other side has monopoly on vice. And so when you try to use politics to fill the hole in your soul, you're seeking to get out of the sense of anxiety, alienation, depression, but you're simply winding up in a state of moral war. And it makes everybody mean and brutal and makes all the problems worse. So, I've tried to describe a kind of unpleasant America and an unpleasant world, a negative mood. What's the cause? What are the deep roots of the negative mood that I think is leading to populism and leading to authoritarianism? Well, I'll start with some child psychology. There was a guy named John Bowlesby many years ago who said one of my favorite sayings about life in general. And the saying is, all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. All of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. And he's a child psychologist, so he meant you need a strong family, a strong home, and then you can be daring and having a daring life. So do we have that in the world today? Do people have a secure base? Do they have the opportunity to do daring explorations? And I think both those things are in decline. So what is a secure base? A secure base, in Bowlesby's terms, was family. And family is not something you choose. Family is something that we're bred into. It's deep in our soul. People are not transformed by institutions to which they are lightly attached. We're attached to this specific family, this specific sacred piece of land, this specific country, this specific philosophy or faith. These are things that we don't choose often, but they are deeply woven into the fabric of our identity of who we are, and they give us a secure psychological base. When we get married, it's not a contract. We're not doing it because it's in our self-interest. We're doing it because we're willing to make a lifelong commitment, hopefully, to another human being. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was the head rabbi in Britain until he died recently, explained the difference between a contract and a covenant. He wrote, "A contract is about interests. A covenant is about identity. It is about you and me coming together to form an us. That is why contracts benefits. A contract will benefit a person, but a covenant will transform a person." And specifically, it is these attachments often, for most of us, to these deep things that are woven into our soul. First, the family. Second, the sacred place, loyalty to America, loyalty to your town, loyalty to your country. And third is a sense of a moral order. Now, people who are religious have a sense that there is a coherent moral order that is not dependent on our choices. And you don't have to be religious to believe that there is a sense of that the world is morally coherent, and you can build your life around a sense that there is such a thing as right and wrong. Civil rights movement, based on the idea that, as Lincoln said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. If segregation is not wrong, nothing is wrong. There is a coherent moral order woven into the fabric of human life. George Marsden is a historian who wrote, "What gave such widely compelling force to King's leadership and oratory was his bedrock conviction that moral law was built into the universe." And so it's very hard to feel existentially safe if everything's up for grabs. If right and wrong are up for grabs, if your family are up for grabs, if your country is up for grabs, it's hard to feel secure. Now, liberalism, democratic liberalism, which I revere, is based on individual choice. It's based on the idea that we respect human dignity, and we respect our choices. But liberal societies only prosper when they are based on things that precede choice. There's only a firm foundation for us to make our choices when there is these covenantal obligations to each other through family, through nation, through God, or through some idea that there's a thing that's called right and wrong. And when individual choice gets so extreme that it eats away at the covenants of our life, then it begins to erode the foundation of liberal society. And in my view, over the last few years, we've had an extreme form of liberalism. And this is measurable. There's this thing called the World Values Survey. And the World Values Survey, they go all around the world and they ask people about their values, about how individualistic, how much you believe in autonomy, or how much you believe in community. And especially in Europe and the English-speaking world, over the last 20 years, our values have shifted away from the world. This is my view of a slide. I'm going to hold up a chart, which most of you will not be able to see. That's my slide. This is my technology. But basically, the slide shows values all around the world. The African world is over here, Latin America is over here, the Confucian world is over here, and way out sticking at the end is the US and Western Europe. Our values have shifted away from the rest of the world. We're much more individualistic, much more autonomous, and we've entered this form of extreme liberalism, where everything is a matter of choice. I remember I was teaching at Yale, only teach at schools I couldn't have gone into. And we were going around the classroom, and the students were talking about what they want to do after college. And we got to one of my best students, a woman named Zara from Ghana, and she said, "Well, you have to understand, it's not my choice. It's the village sent me here." And she just comes from much more communal culture than those of us in the West. But we have gotten so individualistic, I think we've begun to undermine the fundamental foundations. Our families are in trouble, patriotism is in trouble, our sense of social trust with one another is in trouble. And that points to, I think, the most disorienting thing, that's subtly disorienting to a lot of us, what I call the privatization of morality. It's not only the privatization of morality is the idea that each of us has to come up with our own moral values. And this is an extreme form of liberalism. It's an extreme form of individualism. And if your name is Aristotle or Nietzsche, maybe you can come up with your own moral philosophy. Most of us learn our morals in morally cohesive communities. In our neighborhoods, in our families, we have that sense of right and wrong formed within us by the people who love us and the people who embrace us. And we have some sort of existential security because of that. But when you privatize morality, then everyone's set adrift. And it's not only adrift like physically, deeply at the core of our souls, we're set adrift. And Walter Lippmann, a great columnist in the middle of the 20th century, saw this coming. In 1955, he wrote a book called Essays in Public Philosophy. And he wrote, "If what is good, what is right, what is true, is only what the individual chooses to invent, then we are outside the traditions of civility." And so what I'm really describing here is a sense of constant flux. a constant flux, not only in a lot of things in our life, which is good, but in the deepest foundations of our lives. And this situation was foreseen also by two writers who I have never quoted from in a talk, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. I'm not a Marxist, but in the Communist Manifesto, they wrote that bourgeois capitalist life will lead to the constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation. They wrote all fixed, fast-frozen relationships with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. New formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face the sober senses, the real conditions of his life and his relations with his kind. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned. It's that sense of deep inner disturb that I think haunts a lot of us. And the authoritarians know exactly what to do with this. Whether it's Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Iran, Hamas, Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen, MAGA, what unites them? They say, I'm going to restore order. I'm going to restore order to the street. I'm going to restore order to the borders. I'm also going to restore order to your soul. They stand up for family. They stand up for what to me are reactionary values on LGBTQ issues. They stand up for everything, and they make it all about order. And so a lot of people flock to the authoritarians and the populism because they're not only saying, screw those elites, they're saying, I'm restoring order to your deepest anxieties. And it's just tremendously powerfully appealing to people all around the world. So that's the first part, the lack of a secure base and the authoritarians promising. Of course, they're not really delivering a secure base, they're just delivering authoritarian narcissism. But it has this spiritual resonance with people. So the second part of that John Bowlesby quote, that all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base, is a part about the daring explorations. The chance and the opportunity to make sure your future is going to be better than your past. We all need that sense that our life has some movement, some purpose, some progress. And for a lot of us, it does. But for a lot of people in American society, it doesn't. And the key divide in American society right now, and the key divide in our politics, is over education levels. And this is not only true in America, it's true in all the countries I've been talking about, what they call the diploma divide. So why would there be this gap, which did not used to exist? It used to be the political divisions were about money. Rich voted Republican, poorer people voted for the Democrats. Now it's highly educated people vote for the Democrats, less educated people vote for the Republicans. And this basic pattern occurs again and again and again all around the world. Why is that? The short answer to me, and the reason a lot of people feel they don't have a chance of possibility in daring explorations, is that the game is rigged. That rich people just have vastly better educational opportunities than poor people. Our sorting society has created a caste system. 3-year-olds who come from a home with parents making over $100,000 a year are twice as likely to attend preschool as poorer kids. By 8th grade, children from affluent families are performing 4 grade levels higher than children from poorer families. Students who grow up in a home making over $200,000 a year have a 1 in 5 chance of scoring a 1,400 on their SATs, 1 in 5. For poorer kids, the chances are 1 in 50. At every step of the way, kids from highly educated parents and highly affluent parents have this huge advantage. There's a guy named Daniel Markovits who calculates that if you would add up all the things that affluent parents give to their kids, whether it's private school tuition, oboe practice, soccer practice, travel teams, even trips to museums, trips to Europe, it amounts to a $10 million investment in each kid. And they just soar ahead. And kids whose families can't make that contribution, they fall way behind. And so Markovits makes, to me, the shocking claim, which he's a very careful scholar, is that the educational gap between rich kids and poor kids is now wider than the educational gap between whites and blacks in the era of Jim Crow. That's just a yawning gap. And it has produced a caste society. We don't live in a single society anymore. We live in a society divided by educational levels. In 2003, there was a woman named Annette Lareau, a great sociologist, who studied how children are raised. And she said people from working class backgrounds practice what she called natural growth parenting. Life is hard, let the kids enjoy their childhood. Children from college-educated families practice what she called concerted cultivation, which is how I raised my kids and how a lot of you probably raised your kids. The calendar becomes the central thing on the door, and you're shepherding your kid to sports practices, to oboe practices, to whatever. And you're really investing in your kids so your kid can thrive in the meritocracy. But it has created a vast difference. So college-educated people live very different lives than high school-educated people. The average high school grad in this country lives 8 years shorter than the average college grad. 40% of high school grads are obese compared to 20% of college grads. High school grads are much less likely to marry and twice as likely to get divorced than college grads. 60% of births to women with a high school degree happen out of wedlock. That's a rate 20 times higher than college grads. The opioid death rate for those with a high school degree was 10 deaths per 100,000. 10 deaths per 100,000. For a college degree, it was only 2 deaths per 100,000. And so these are just vast chasms in how we live, how we prosper or don't prosper. And so a lot of people look at that gap and they say the system is rigged. And populists attack the educated class. Or as Donald Trump once put it, I love the poorly educated. And so populists say those elites, they've rigged the game, they've closed off opportunities, you are screwed and I will fix the problem. And so on both these deep levels, the need for a secure spiritual foundation for your life and a sense of hope, populists claim to have an answer. And so I'll spend 3 minutes on what we should do to repair the situation. The first is people who are in the center and people who are on the left have to have some version of faith, family, and flag. We have too often allowed populist authoritarians to grab, for example, patriotism. I took a walk today with a guy named Richard Reeves, who's speaking here today, and he's from Britain. And he noticed that the far right was seizing the British flag and seizing a lot of the symbols of British patriotism. So there's a paper in the UK called The Guardian, which many of you know, it's a progressive paper, and on page 2, they had a big full-page picture of the Red Cross, which is what, there's a certain symbol of England, and that the whole page 2 was that. And on the page 1 editorial said, we're not letting the far right take this from us. Please cut out this piece of paper and hang it in your window of your living room. Because we're going to re-seize patriotism. We're not going to let the right have that. So that's the first thing. And similarly, progressives and centrists have to have a way to talk about the sacredness of family and the sacredness of patriotism. Second, and this is Fred Riley, who is executive director of Weave, the Social Fabric Project, which we work on together. It's the need to give people a secure base, give them interpersonal trust. 71% of young people, Gen Z, ask them, do you agree with this statement? Most people are selfish and out to get you. 71% of Gen Z, yes. How do you not live with fear if you think most people are selfish and out to get you? And that's low social trust. And so what we do at Weave is we take people who are building trust at the local level and we try to support them. Trust is built locally by people who show up for you, by people who are there with you, by people who know you. I wrote a book that came out in October called How to Know a Person, and it was based on the idea that trust it exists. Existential security exists when the people around you see, hear, respect, and know you. When reporting that book, I was down in Waco, Texas, and I was at a diner, and I'm having breakfast with I think a 95-year-old lady named LaRue Dorsey. And she presents herself to me as this stern disciplinarian, like she'd been a teacher, and she said, I loved my students enough to discipline them. And I was a little intimidated by this drill sergeant lady. But into the diner walks a mutual friend of ours named Jimmy Durrell. And Jimmy Durrell sees us, he comes up to the diner, he grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders and shakes her way harder than you should ever shake a 95-year-old. But he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you, I love you. And that stern disciplinarian lady that I've been talking to, in an instant, turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. With the power of his gaze, he brought out a different version of her. And that's when you have people around you who are able to see you in that way, then you feel seen, heard, you feel safe. We evolve to be surrounded by people who are looking out for us. And part of the reason Jimmy Durrell was able to do that is that he's a warmer personality than I am. But part of it is he's a pastor. He pastors to the homeless in Waco. He has a church called Church Under the Bridge. The homeless people didn't feel comfortable going into his church, so he brought the church to them. He has it under a highway overpass where they sleep. And so he's a pastor. So he thinks every person he sees is made in the image of God. Every person he sees has a soul of infinite value and dignity. Every person he sees is so important, Jesus was willing to die for that person. Now, you could be Christian or Jewish or atheist or Muslim or Buddhist, I don't care. But we have to learn to see each other with that level of reverence and respect, or else we will feel unseen, disrespected, unheard, existentially unsafe. So that's ways to try to create a secure base. In the community, as Weave does, interpersonally, as I hope to do in my book, and on the national level, as people come up with new ways to secure the family, secure the flag, and secure faith. Then, on the other side of the equation, we somehow have to create more opportunity for a wider array of people. We have to fix the meritocracy. In the 1930s, a guy named James Conant, who was president of Harvard, created our modern meritocracy. It is not a natural growth, it's an ideological project. And his ideological project was the central human trait is intelligence. And we're going to sort people, starting at age 5, by how smart they are. And I'm fine with intelligence. It's a good trait to have. It's not the most important trait in human ability. To me, the most important trait in human ability is hunger. It's the drive to keep working, to keep learning, to keep moving, and to keep getting better at something. The second trait is the ability to work in teams. There's a funny thing that there's zero correlation between how you do in school and how you do in life. Grades predict nothing. And that's because school is all about self. It's about how am I doing individually. Life is generally about how am I doing as a team? How am I doing with others? So there's a basic non sequitur between schools and life. The third trait, I think, is character. Ask people, somebody did a study, why do people get fired? In only 11% of cases are people fired because they're not smart enough to do the job or they lack the technical knowledge. The main reason people get fired, 89% of cases, is because they're assholes or they're unteachable, they're uncoachable. They don't do well with their teammates. And so somehow we have to build a meritocracy around a broader definition of merit that won't be able to be gamed by the rich. A definition of merit that includes drive, resilience, good character, empathy, social ability. And if we widen out that, how we define merit, I think we'll have a fairer society. And we won't have these bottlenecks for people. So these are tough times. Sometime last November, I was at a hotel bar on my travels. And if you'd seen me there, you would have said, sad guy drinking alone. But I call it reporting. And so I was at the bar, and I'm on Twitter, of course, and I'm scrolling through all these images, mostly from the Middle East, and they're just brutal images. And you think about the famous dates of our century are just brutal dates. September 11th, January 6th, October 7th. It's tempting in these times to turn into what the authoritarians want us to be, which is war of all against all. Us versus them, it's just war. And yet, as I'm scrolling through my phone looking at all these images, I come across a video, and it's an interview with James Baldwin. And he gave the interview, sometime it looked from the black and white images, it looked like the early 60s. Now, Baldwin was a guy who was horribly mistreated by his society because of the color of his skin and because of his sexual orientation. And that guy had a right to feel bitter and hatred. He had the right to sink into the enmity that drives so much of our politics. But in this interview, he says, there's not as much humanity as you would like in the world, but there's enough. There's more than you would think. And then he says, you've got to remember, as you walk down the street, every single person you meet, that could be you. You could be that person. You could be that saint, you could be that monster, and you've got to decide who you're going to be. And so he could have calloused over, as I said, but instead he had this mentality, I could be that person. I may like them, I may not like them, that could be me. And the phrase that leapt to mind as I was listening to this little 60-minute or 60-second clip was defiant humanism. That even in brutal times, when a lot of our political opponents are brutal and monstrous and frankly authoritarian, that perversely and paradoxically, the way to rebut them is to be more human, is to touch the things that really we do need to solve our souls and to emphasize the deepest parts of our nature. Thank you very much. Now I've left some time for question and answer. If anybody has comments or questions, all that I ask is you make them long and meandering with no question at the end. We'll start at the front with, do we have any mic runners? We have a mic runner.
Can you talk about your thoughts, how social media, for young people especially, contributes to depression and loneliness?
Yeah. So the mental health crisis has many causes, as you'd expect. Some of it, as I said, I think is philosophical and cultural in nature, which is what I tried to describe. And I was a little skeptical that social media was really leading to this incredible ramp up in depression and suicide. And my argument, and I'm friends with a guy named Jonathan Haidt, who's written about this, was that social media is everywhere, but depression and suicide are not going up in Denmark. They're not going up in Ghana. But Jonathan has persuaded me with a fair boatload of data that, in fact, they are going up everywhere. Wherever there's social media, there's a rise in suicide and a rise in depression. Now, we happen to get it worse because you combine social media with a highly individualistic culture where people feel solitude, the effect is going to be a lot worse. So I am become convinced that social media truly is horrible. Not that I get off it, but and that one of Jonathan's proposals, which I think is gaining great traction, it's rare you see somebody in my business say we should do this, and then suddenly all across the country people are doing it. And Jonathan's one proposal is no phones in schools. And school district after school district is now adopting this. And it's like a lot of technologies. At first we don't know the dangers, but once we learn the dangers, we adapt. And so I think that's happening with social media, we're adapting. I think that'll happen with AI eventually too, but maybe way there in the back.
Information. Could you restate the source of the motivating quote at the beginning about base and exploration? Who was that?
A guy named John Bowlesby, who was the father of the thing called attachment theory. I think he was like 1940s, 1950s. John Bowlesby. All of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. I see a couple. Oh, Katie.
Thank you. I just love you, David Brooks. Thank you for this incredible presentation. You're so thoughtful and smart and compassionate. But I wanted to ask you for some real-world advice. And this isn't going to be a long story, I promise, but I did a breast cancer walk recently, and a woman came up to me and said, I really love you, even though we're very different politically, I'm pretty sure. And then I tried to kind of talk to her. And I said, oh, well, why are you feeling the way you're feeling? And I said, do you believe the election was rigged? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, but there's 60 plus lawsuits. I did the whole thing, like why it wasn't. And she said, no, I really think it was. I've seen evidence. And can you tell us how to talk to people, and how to lean into our humanity when people believe things that just aren't true?
Yeah.
it's really hard, right? I mean, I was nice to her, but I just was frustrated.
Yeah. This is a paradox that you're asking me this question, because one of my earlier years here, a woman came up to me after I gave a talk, and it was one of my more personal talks, and she talked about her son getting killed in a car crash, and I had no idea what to say. But I happened to be behind Katie Couric at the security line at the Aspen Airport on the way out, so I asked you, what do you say? And you gave me good advice, mostly just hugs. But I would say, so I'm at a baseball game, and it's the ninth inning in Washington, and a guy turns around to me and says, "Hey, are you David Brooks?" And I think, oh, nice. He'll say, "Oh, I like your column. I like your show, whatever." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You're a fucking asshole." And and my son was there, and he said to my son, "You should be ashamed of your father. He's awful." And this was a Trump guy, and my wife is there, and she's trying to calm him down. She says, "Get off me, woman." And then he says, "I'm shaking. I'm in the presence of evil." And I'm like, ooh. And I would like to think that at that moment, my son and I rose above conflict and reached out with compassion and empathy and understanding. Sadly, that did not happen. We were as nasty as he was. So I'm not, and my wife was genuinely angry with me, with the right to be. But what I've learned, I highly recommend a book called Crucial Conversations by a guy named Joseph Grenny and a bunch of other people. It's how to have these hard conversations. And they point out something which I've learned when somebody comes at me with that kind of critique from a Trump supporter or whatever, or from the further left, my first job is to stand in their standpoint. It's to ask them 3 or 4 or 5 times, how did you come to believe what you believe? And I never ask people anymore, what do you believe? I ask, how did you come to believe that? Because that way you're getting them in narrative mode. And they talk about an experience, they talk about somebody who shaped their values. So I ask them 3 or 4 or 5 times. And I may not persuade them, I may not agree, but at least I'm showing them the respect of curiosity. And in this book, Crucial Conversations, the authors say, in any conversation, respect is like air. When it's present, nobody notices. When it's absent, it's all anybody can think about. And so a lot of the people who hold these views feel profoundly disrespected. And if you can show them respect, I'm not sure it will persuade them. I'm not sure anything. I've been written a million anti-Trump columns in the last 7 years for all the good it's done to the world. But at least you'll show them that respect. And I think that will solve some of the sense of hurt, the sense that you people look down on me. And the other thing those people in Crucial Conversations say is that every conversation exists at 2 levels. What we're nominally talking about, and the real conversation, which is the flow of emotions flowing between us. With every comment we make to each other, we're making each other feel more respected or less respected, more safe or less safe. And so by standing in their standpoint, hopefully you're making them feel more safe and less condescended to. And I don't know if that'll change the world, but it's the only thing I can think of. Maybe in the back I see a couple hands. We've got 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
Thank you for your talk. Fidel Vargas, President and CEO of the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, and I apologize that I came in a little late. But one of the other things I seem to notice, and I would love to hear your perspective, homogenous societies versus diverse societies. Yeah. France, the United States versus, say, Japan. How is that playing out? Because it's a whole lot easier to say the other and who's causing our problems. How does that play into everything?
Yeah, I mean, we evolved to live with 150 people like ourselves. We evolved for homogeneity. We now get to live, and it's a privilege and honor to live in much more diverse societies. And to me, it's a wonderfully great thing, but it's just tougher. It's tougher for me to relate to somebody whose lifestyle, whose historical narrative is vastly different than my own. And that one of the reasons I wrote that book, How to Know a Person, is because we have to up our social skills to fit the society we're living in. And these traits go super deep. There was an election in Connecticut. A guy named Ned Lamont ran against a guy named Joe Lieberman. And researchers found after that election that every town that was settled by the Portuguese in the 17th century voted for Lieberman, and every town settled by the English voted for Lamont. These are 350-year-old categories, and they're still shaping belief. I have a party conversation. You can tell how fun I am at parties, where I ask the following question, and I asked it at a dinner party recently: how do your ancestors show up in your life? It's like we all know we're formed by our heritage, but how? And so there was a Dutch family there, and they talked about their Dutch heritage. There was a black family there. They talked about the African-American experience. I talked about 5,000 years of Jewish history, which I'm sure was a scintillating 2.5 hours for them. But, you know, we're so deeply formed by our ancient heritages. And you just have to be very socially skilled to see people in that level of profound difference. But once you do it, it's fun. And I'll close with this bit of research, a concrete way to change your life. So I'm buddies with a guy named Nick Epley, who's a social psychologist at the University of Chicago. And because he's a social psychologist, he knows that the thing that makes us happiest is talking to each other. We're pretty relational social animals. And so he's on his commuter train on the way up to campus from his home, and he's looking around the car, and everybody is on their phones. Not a single person is talking to each other. So he's a social psychologist. For the next couple months, he pays people on the train to talk to a stranger. And he asks them afterwards, when they get off the train, how'd you like it? And they all say, that was the most enjoyable ride I've had in months. We underestimate how much we want to talk to each other. We underestimate how much we're going to go deep. We want to go deep. And so I did a presentation with him at Chicago a couple months ago now, and we're doing our conversation on stage, and he says, stop, I'm going to make everybody in this room find a stranger, and for the next 10 minutes, tell them about the last time you cried. And you hear this groan go up from the crowd. And he says, how many of you want to do this? And a few hands go up. How many of you don't want to do it? 80% of the hands went up. And he said, go. And they did it. And 10 minutes pass, and we can't get them to shut up so we can get back to our conversation. And then finally, when they do come up, he says, how many of you enjoyed that? And 80% of the hands went up. And that's just a small practical thing. So now when I'm on the plane, I often talk to the stranger. I wait till there's only an hour left in the flight in case it'll be boring, but still. But it's just a concrete, practical way to instill a little social relationship, a little social trust, and to weaken the kind of existential loneliness that I think is the cause of a lot of our problems. So thank you very much.